On behalf of the Cumberland School of Law and Stanford University, I want to welcome you all to this very, very important occasion. I also especially want to welcome the Gruber Foundation, particularly Pat Gruber and the folks from Gruber that are with us. The story of the Gruber Foundation is a remarkable story. It begins with Peter Gruber, who was born in 1929 in Hungary, and in 1939 fled Hungary for India just ahead of World War II. He then found his way to New York, where he became a star on Wall Street. And joined by his wife Pat, he and she founded the Gruber Foundation. In a time when we look at the newspaper and read about the greed on Wall Street, it's remarkable to welcome people who have taken the good fortune that they have gotten and decided to give back to the international community. Please join me in welcoming Pat Gruber and the Gruber Foundation.
Thank you so much, Judge Carroll. Welcome to the presentation of the 9th Annual Justice Prize. The Justice Prize honors individuals who have advanced the cause of justice delivered through the legal system. We are delighted to be here at the Cumberland School of Law in historic Birmingham, a place associated forever in our minds with the importance of civil rights and a most fitting place to present this year's prize. We are here to honor two recipients, the European Roma Rights Centre and Bryan Stevenson, for their outstanding achievements in helping members of oppressed groups gain access to equal justice. Please let me tell you a little about the company they are keeping. The Foundation's prize program, which was established in 2000, now presents 5 annual $500,000 prizes in the fields of cosmology, genetics, neuroscience, justice, and women's rights. Each prize recognizes achievements and discoveries that produce fundamental shifts in human knowledge and culture. On August the 4th, the Cosmology Prize was presented to Wendy Friedman, Robert Kennicott, and Jeremy Mould at the 27th General Assembly of the International Astronomical Union. On October 18th, at the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience, the Neuroscience Prize will be presented to Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young. The Genetics Prize will be presented at the annual meeting of the American Society of Human Genetics on October 23rd to Janet Rowley. And on the 29th of October in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands, where the foundation is headquartered, Lema Bowie and the Women's Legal Center will receive the Women's Rights Prize. My husband unfortunately can't be here today for health reasons, but I would like to acknowledge his vision and leadership in establishing these prizes. Laureates of the Justice Prize include Thomas Bergenthal and Jerome Shestak, Carmen Argabay, Carlos Cerda, and Monica Feria, Aharon Barak, Param Kumaraswamy, Arthur Chaskelson and Pius Langa, Rosalie Silberman Abella and Bertha Wilson, Fali Sam Nariman, and the first prize, Anthony Roy Gubby and Stanford Moyo for the Law Society of Zimbabwe. This year, the 2009 prize recipients were chosen by our distinguished advisory board. They are Carmen Maria Argabay, Giuseppe Bisconti, Arthur Chaskelson, Param Kumaraswamy, Bernice Donald, and Martin Lee. Peter and I deeply appreciate the knowledge, the commitment, and the enthusiasm that these advisors bring to the judging process. On behalf of the Gruber Foundation, I'd like to thank the Cumberland School of Law, all of you, for hosting the Gruber Justice Prize this year, and especially Dean Carroll, who has made our life easy and smooth. They have graciously agreed to host us this year, and Cumberland has gone to great lengths to make every aspect of this effort a success. Now let me present Giuseppe Bisconti, who is here from Rome, Italy. He's a former president of the International Bar Association, a champion of human rights around the world, and an advisor to the Justice Prize. He will begin by reading the prize citation and then make remarks. Giuseppe Bisconti.
The official citation. Oh, here. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you. This is the citation which I'm honored to read. The Peter and Patricia Gruber Foundation proudly presents the 2009 Justice Prize to Bryan Stevenson and the European Roma Rights Centre, ERRC in short, for advancing human rights and the cause of justice. Bryan Stevenson's commitment to skillfully defending the marginalized and youth facing capital charges and to recruiting and training others to do so is an emphatic rejection and response to policies in Alabama and elsewhere of prosecuting such defendants without providing them with effective representation. It demonstrates a passionate commitment to justice for all and has resulted in more than 75 death sentences being overturned. The ERRC has been an indefatigable advocate of human rights for Romani victims of discrimination of all forms, persecution, and violence in Europe. Through presidential litigation before national and regional courts and innovative policy proposals, the ERRC has ensured substantial justice in the face of often indifferent and complicit governments and public opinion in the 13 years since its formation. Presented this 24th day of September 2009 by the Peter and Patricia Gruber Foundation. President Patricia Gruber, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to add a few words to the official citation. The Peter and Patricia Gruber Foundation has been granting annually since several years an International Justice Prize to individuals and in some cases also to institutions, as on this occasion. The prize is granted to individuals or entities who have demonstrated in their lives an extraordinary dedication to what we call the cause of justice, beyond their call of duty, often, and perhaps I should say, always at a personal cost, sometimes even putting their life at stake. Without going into any doctrinal definition, what is justice? Justice embraces many things, many values of our community of human beings, but essentially, the cause of justice means the protection, affirmation, and restoration of the dignity of human beings. All human beings were created or were born as equal. Whether how created, it doesn't matter. And have a right to live and die without wounds to their human dignity, have a right to be treated as equal human beings and not to be subject to prejudice, discrimination, persecution, or violence of any kind. This is what justice essentially is. And the attainment of justice for their fellow human beings is what the awardees of the Gruber Foundation have done, sometimes in a heroic manner. Without giving too much emphasis to words, they're all heroes. And they're all individuals. Then because and behind the institution that we honor today by awarding the prize are also individuals, women and men, young and old. They are our heroes. I would like, if I may, to add my personal recognition and tribute to the honorees of the Peter and Patricia Gruber Foundation because they have been defending the human dignity of all of us. And I'd like to add also my personal tribute and gratitude to the foundation and to Peter Gruber, Patricia and Peter Gruber, because they have made everybody know who these extraordinary individuals are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giuseppe Bisconti. I'd now like to ask Bryan Stevenson and Robert Kushen, Managing Director of the ERRC, and Isabela Mihalache, Deputy Director of the ERRC, to please come forward to receive the prize. No, go ahead. Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. You got it. Okay. That's it. Congratulations. Yes. Our recipients will now make a few remarks.
Well, I'd like to thank the Gruber Foundation for this extraordinary honor. There are many days when it's very challenging to do the work that I think all of us do, and I'd be lying if encouragement and affirmation is meaningless, because it's very meaningful. And that so many of you have come to share in this celebration also makes this especially rewarding for me. The work that I do at the Equal Justice Initiative is work that stands on the shoulders of many, many people. I'm here today with my dad, who I'm going to, if it's okay, indulge a minute and just ask to stand up so I can publicly thank him for his support. I grew up in the rural South. My dad was denied access to public education as a result of racial segregation. When I started my education, we couldn't go to the public schools because we were black. He and thousands of others told me and taught me that these barriers to fairness, these barriers to justice, are not barriers that cannot be overcome. And it's because of that witness, that legacy, that struggle, that I do the work that I do. Nowhere in America have more people fought, struggled, and died to improve access to justice than in Birmingham, Alabama. And so to the Gruber Foundation, you honor me doubly by selecting Birmingham as the site for this award. I work with extraordinary people at the Equal Justice Initiative whose advocacy and efforts build on a legacy of struggle and advocacy and determination. And it's in that spirit that I'm very humbled by this recognition and very grateful to all of you for recognizing our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to offer some remarks on behalf of the Roma Rights Centre and my colleague, Isabela. Thanks to Patricia and Peter Gruber and the Gruber Foundation, to Judge Donald, Dr. Visconti, and the other members of the advisory committee for bestowing this honor on the ERRC. I also want to thank Dean Carroll and the Cumberland School of Law for hosting us today. We are humbled by the list of eminent past recipients that you saw up on the screen, and honored to share the winner's platform with Bryan Stevenson, whose work on the death penalty and access to justice addresses a critical human rights issue in the United States. As modern technology such as DNA evidence brings into sharper relief the vagaries and flaws of our justice system, the fight against capital punishment and other inequalities in the justice system becomes an even greater legal and moral imperative. So we are honored to be here with Bryan Stevenson. In Europe, the fight for human rights and civil liberties for Roma has also reached a critical juncture. The specter of the Holocaust is again upon us, as extremist politicians in the Czech Republic this past summer called for a final solution to the gypsy problem. Racially motivated murders of Roma in Hungary in the past year have gone unpunished, and politicians in Italy, Slovakia, Hungary, and elsewhere rant on about, quote, gypsy criminality and regard the Roma first and foremost as a threat to national security. When Madonna at one of her concerts recently in Romania spoke out against anti-Roma discrimination because she was playing with a number of Romani musicians on her tour, she was roundly booed by the audience. The shift to the market economy in Europe has left many Roma falling further into poverty and despair, and the politics of reaction have made Roma a convenient scapegoat for a variety of socioeconomic ills. The largest minority in Europe and one of the oldest in terms of a presence on the continent is under threat as never before. The European Roma Rights Centre was created in 1996, and it was on the untested proposition that the justice systems of Eastern Europe, with their legacy of communist manipulation, could deliver justice for an oppressed minority. We were aided at that time by the advent of some regional human rights enforcement mechanisms, notably the European Court of Human Rights and the European Committee of Economic and Social Rights, whose jurisdiction expanded to Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism. And we were also aided by at least lip service or a nominal focus in Europe on human rights and justice reform, as many of these countries in Eastern Europe strove to become members of the European Union. Looking back on that time, while the ERRC has achieved some notable victories, impressive court victories, some law reform, and a degree of justice for individual complainants, on the other side of the ledger, real systemic change has proven much more elusive. Segregation, discrimination, and racially motivated violence against Roma persist. Socioeconomic indicators for Roma are as bad as ever. And the countries of Western Europe have proven to be no role model when it comes to the treatment of Roma and the protection of human rights. Now, Jack Greenberg, who is a law professor of mine at Columbia University and a lawyer in the Brown versus Board of Education discrimination case before the Supreme Court in 1954, in his second career has become a Roma rights advocate and activist. And he visited Bulgaria in 2003 and visited some pilot programs in integrating schools there. And when he returned from that trip, he confidently foresaw the end of segregation and the speedy integration of Roma in Eastern Europe. Jack Greenberg went back to Eastern Europe in the fall of last year and reported his dismay that his optimism had been misplaced. And what he wrote in his report was, "The wish was the father of the thought." As the experience in the United States has shown, the fight for equal rights requires decades and generations of vision and sweat, confrontation and cooperation. With the help of the Gruber Foundation, we at the ERRC will work hard to make that wish a reality. Thank you all again for coming, and thank you for your support.
to raise this curtain, and you can take your seats there. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to present the moderator for today's panel discussion with the prize recipients, Judge Bernice Donald, also an advisor to the Justice Prize who serves on the selection committee. Judge Donald served on the U.S. District Court for Western Tennessee since being appointed by President Clinton as Tennessee's first black female district court judge in January of 1966, the same year in which Chief Justice Rehnquist appointed her to the Judicial Conference Advisory Committee on Bankruptcy Rules. She has this year received the American Bar Association's Liberty Achievement Award and has begun her first term as the American Bar Association's first person of color to serve as secretary of the 400,000 member group. Judge Donald serves as faculty for the Federal Judicial Center and the National Judicial College and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Federal Judicial Center. She's a former member of the Board of Governors and the House of Delegates of the American Bar Association and currently serves on the Council of Litigation section. Immensely respected by her peers and by us, she is a champion of women's rights and encourages younger members of the profession with much enthusiasm. Judge Donald.
Thank you, Pat. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon on the occasion when the EERC, represented by Robert Kushen and Isabela Mihalache, and Bryan Stevenson received the 2009 Peter and Patricia Gruber Justice Prize. What a wonderful occasion. And I am so grateful to each of you for being here to help in that celebration. Now, you've heard something about the recipients, but I know you want to have an opportunity to dialogue, and I'm going to try to facilitate that process. But before I begin, I want to extend my personal thanks to Judge Carroll and the Cumberland Law School for hosting this event. It is most meaningful. I want to start the questioning by asking a general question and offering my congratulations to each of you. You know that our theme today is access to justice for underserved populations. And as Bryan Stevenson said, what better place to have this conversation on the occasion of this prize than in Birmingham, Alabama, which is largely believed to be the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement. We know from our knowledge of the area, and if we've gone to the Civil Rights Museum, that justice is born of struggle. Dr. King said that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we know, many of you are law students, some of you are lawyers, others of you are in higher education, but we know that laws are not self-executing. There are many documents which extol the virtue of equal rights, equal justice, human rights, but the practices do not mirror the documents. And so justice depends on the efforts of men and women like you, individuals. It needs your hearts, your hands, your energies, and your compassion and commitment to make justice a reality. The people here have extended themselves to make justice a reality for these underserved populations. And I want to start by asking just a general question to which I'd like each of you to respond. And that is, tell me what you have found to be the most significant barriers to access to justice for the populations that you represent today, in 2009. And we can start with Bryan Stevenson.
Well, thank you, Judge. I think the big barriers that we face have to do with the law, but also with just political development. Mass incarceration has radically reshaped American society. In 1972, there were 200,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. And that tremendous increase in the number of people being sent to jail and prison has not been accompanied by an increase in the commitment to providing legal services to that population. And so, in my view, this development, this evolution of using the criminal justice system as a mechanism for dealing with a lot of problems is one of the big barriers. The second problems relate to the way in which we enforce rights. In my state here of Alabama, we have a lot of people who cannot get access to effective legal assistance. And the American criminal justice system is very wealth dependent in my judgment. Our system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And that does not characterize a system that, in my judgment, is fair and reliable. And to correct that, we've got to provide better access to lawyers and legal services. I represent people on death row, many of whom are literally dying for legal representation. At any given moment, we have anywhere from a dozen to 20-some people on death row in Alabama with no legal representation. We have half the people in the state on death row who are represented by attorneys who, by law, could not be paid more than $1,000, even in the last several weeks.
Let me interrupt you, though, because you say that there are people on death row without representation. We know that under U.S. law, an individual who is accused of a crime that carries the possibility of incarceration is required by law to have a lawyer. So how can this be in the richest country in America with a sound system of law that requires representation? How can it be? We
haven't defined what that providing a lawyer means. And so what essentially the courts have held is that, yes, you're entitled to a lawyer at trial and in the initial stage of appeal, but after that, you're not entitled to a lawyer. There have been some 130 people who have been exonerated, proved innocent after being sentenced to death. All of those exonerations took place in proceedings where there is no right to counsel. And even where you have that right to counsel, again, in Alabama, half the people on our death row were represented by lawyers who, by statute, couldn't get paid more than $1,000. And so that's not a meaningful right to counsel in our view.
Okay, well, before I go to Isabela and Robert, I want to dwell on this because obviously we're in a time in this country where all states have many competing obligations. And a state that has an obligation to educate its children, provide health care to its citizens, and do a myriad of other things. I mean, can the state reasonably be expected to allocate what some might say is disproportionate resources to individuals on death row? I know that death is different, but how should a state balance that?
Well, no state is obligated to execute people. And my judgment is if you want to engage in the luxury of executing some of your citizens, you've got to make that commitment to make those executions fair and just. In the absence of that, I believe you create the kind of injustice that undermines all aspects of the society. I mean, if we're serious about trying to balance our economic resources, we would stop spending billions of dollars, more billions, on incarceration for nonviolent offenders and a whole host of people who are not a threat to public safety, and instead invest those billions into education in these other areas. There's a direct correlation between the decrease in spending around public education and the increase in prison construction and mass incarceration. So I don't believe that these things can be pitted against each other. And at the bottom line, if we commit to providing services to people in a complete and meaningful way, we eliminate all of these debates. We just had a decision in our state court here that has held there is no right to counsel on direct appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court in a death penalty case, which means we now have people who can't even get that level of review. That's a judgment that, in my view, threatens not just the plight of those people on death row, but all of us in this state who want to believe that our state is committed to justice in a way where we don't have to worry about executing the innocent or treating unfairly those who are poor.
I'm sure we'll get back to that because it's an incredible discussion. But I want to turn to Isabela and or Robert to ask you to respond to what are the obstacles that you see to providing access to justice in these underserved and marginalized populations. And I'll leave it to you on who wishes to begin the conversation.
I'll begin the conversation, then I'll ask Isabela to fill it with content. Bryan's remarks were quite reminiscent of the situation in Europe, although I think in Eastern Europe in particular, we're in a much more resource-poor setting. But the absence of a firm legal obligation to provide counsel, except for a sort of general requirement in the European Convention on Human Rights, which talks about providing counsel when the interests of justice so require, has meant that in many countries the legal obligation is quite porous. In addition, a lack of legal services and legal aid, particularly legal services and legal aid targeting Roma communities. But moreover, there's a profound lack of faith in and awareness of the justice system, and people in Romani communities simply don't trust the justice system to deliver justice. Isa, maybe you want to take off on that a little bit.
Definitely. I mean, when it comes to the lack of faith in the legal system, I just want to refer to a recent report that the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency has published this year that is called discrimination against Roma in 7 member states. And that's illustrative of the way people refer to the legal system in itself, because mainly big majority of people, around 72%, responded that basically they don't report instances of personal victimization, of assault, harassment, because simply they don't have the confidence that the police can do anything about it. And there are people that fear also that there's going to be negative consequences if they report, where they are afraid of the perpetrators, where in some instances 36% to 40% basically responded that they fear of the police because of previous negative experience that they have with the police. So that's kind of illustrative of the way people refer to the legal system in itself. And I also wanted to touch upon it, unless you want to continue on this.
Well, Isabela, before you do that, let me just, you mentioned that some people don't report victimizations because they're concerned, and part of this is based on past perceptions that the police are going to
in some of the cases, it's the police itself, it's the perpetrator.
Okay. So is this belief simply born of past actions, or does it still reflect a current reality? I mean, are the Roma community members still being victimized by law enforcement?
Right, that's an important question. Yes, it does reflect on current situation. And just an example, I think it was Czech Republic or Slovakia, where you had 5 or 6 police officers that put children to hit themselves, and they obliged them to get naked in a police station. And even so, they even recorded the scene and they posted on the YouTube just to exemplify the extent of violence, and even the belief of the police that there's not going to be punishment for that. And also the disbelief comes also from the fact that, for instance, in Hungary in the past year, we had 8 hate crimes against Roma, and there's been no perpetrator found guilty, which obviously is related directly with the efficiency of the law enforcement and the commitment the police has into finding the perpetrators. These are just very few examples, but I could continue.
And I know Robert wanted to make a further comment, but before he does, let me just say that members of the Gruber staff have cards, index cards. If you'd like to post questions, they'll be going through the audience collecting your cards. If you want a card and you don't already have one, raise your hand. Someone will bring you one. But we'd love to have your questions, so get them to us. And Robert, I think you wanted to make a comment?
No, I think Isabela summed it up. We can move on.
Well, I just wanted to ask again for the ERC, has expansion of EU membership affected access to justice for the Roma in a measurable or positive way? And if not, why do you think that is?
Well, again, let me offer some general remarks. I think European Union membership has had very limited impact. The biggest impact, arguably, was when many of the countries of Eastern Europe became parties to the European Convention on Human Rights, and then joined into this regional enforcement mechanism. But when states become members of the European Union, they're asked to undergo certain reforms in the area of justice, but very little of that is really rights-focused, and very little of that trickles down to the level of meaningful change for Roma. And Isa, I don't know if you want to talk about the example of Romania, which is one that you know well.
Yeah, and I also would like to also actually refer generally to the EU member states after accession, and more precisely to the equality bodies, because they are the monitoring bodies that look at discrimination across Europe, and the ones that collect complaints against discrimination. To say that throughout the European Union member states, you can see that this is a very deficient mechanism that lacks many times the budget to implement activities, and they don't have enough human resources to reach out to different communities to raise the awareness of people about these mechanisms to enforce human rights. And what I can say is that, as Rob has strengthened that, my personal view is that in the process of accession, there is more to it. There is more leverage for countries, for NGOs, civil society, to actually push for more sustainable and consistent human rights system of the countries. But unfortunately, so far, the Copenhagen criteria on minorities has never been the defining criteria for a country to access the European Union. And although the reports foresee already challenges for including the Roma population into societies, the countries don't really act on it. And once you are in the European Union, it's so little you can do as the European Commission. And as we can see now, we have within the European Union hate crime that is going unpunished, and the European Union not being able to respond with the member states to counteract the situation. And then it's very worrisome, and then it makes you wonder whether this is something that we should push for, meaning the membership of the European Union, or maybe it's better to actually push the states to highly consider whether the country has really managed to progress on integrating the minorities, and to actually, I think when it comes to Roma, it would be very considerate to think of having a separate maybe progress report on the situation of Roma people, just because the report as it stands speaks only about the situation of Roma in health, situation of Roma in employment, and it always recommends to member states that progress has been made, but there are still steps that the country has to do. There is no specific steps that the Commission is actually advising for member states to take, meaning there is a lot of flexibility for the countries to decide on where they have to improve and by how much. There are not actually concrete indicators by how much a country has to improve on integrating its minorities, so that it basically coincides with the requirements of the European Union.
Thank you. I want to go back to Bryan now, because Bryan, you are obviously a very distinguished lawyer and professor. You are respected and known across the land. Law firms would love to have you. Major law firms would love to have you as a member of their staff, and yet you've chosen to do this death penalty work. Isabela talked about perceptions for a little bit, and I know that there are some issues with perception in the justice system here in the United States. I want to just ask you, why have you committed your talents and your life's work to this cause, and I want you to also talk about some of the things that that the EJI has accomplished, and from a policy standpoint, where do you want this country to be as a country? Because I know that we stand almost as one of just a couple of countries that still has the death penalty. Mm-hmm. So I know that's sort of a three-part and kind of a disjointed question, but let me hear you.
Well, I appreciate the question. I think that all societies have to remain vigilant and deeply committed to what being a just society requires. I mean, listening to Isabela, reminded me of how easy it is for us to congratulate ourselves as being beyond discrimination. Discrimination goes with myopia. We're very good at seeing other people's problems, but not very good at seeing our own. I went to Budapest in the late 90s and spent some time with the Roma Rights Centre, and I was there to talk about the African American experience in this country and about the history of segregation and marginalization and how I thought it related so directly to the experience of Romani people throughout Eastern Europe. And people were quite willing to accept the history of abuse and discrimination of African Americans in America, but very unwilling to accept the parallels with Roma people. And to me, they were quite obvious. And it's in part because we don't do enough, I think, to really commit to what confronting justice means. I mean, even here, I spend a lot of time now in rural communities. We have a new project working with the Black Belt. We have some wonderful people, Catherine Flowers and others, who are helping us in this region, where you meet people who are still carrying the legacy of apartheid and segregation, who are still bearing the burdens of that history. And older people come up to me and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear people talking on TV about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history. They're very provoked by this notion that the 9/11 was the beginning of terrorism in America. They say, I grew up with terrorism. I grew up having to worry about being bombed, about having to be threatened, worrying about being lynched. These communities were created out of a fear of racial violence. And we still live in these segregated situations because of that history. And so it makes me angry when people are talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history. And that anger carries with it some trauma. And that legacy and that history and those injuries are, in my judgment, things we have to reconcile. We've got to address. So part of why I do what I do is because in many ways these problems that have been a long time in the making are going to require decades of dedicated solutions. And I think we have too quickly forgotten about all of the wounds, all of the injuries, and we have too quickly stopped trying to think honestly about what a just society requires. And that leads to the kinds of problems that our office deals with at EJI. We're again trying to recover some vision, some commitment to dealing with these problems. And it is complicated. It is sometimes overwhelming, but I think it is essential for a free society, a just society, to recognize these issues. That's mostly why I do it. I also do it because I just have very basic beliefs. I believe that each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. I learned that growing up in a poor community, in a community of color, surrounded by people who made mistakes. And I've just come to believe that every person is more than their worst mistake. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And because of that, there's this basic human dignity that must be respected by law. And if we ignore that human dignity, we imperil all of us. Martin Luther King used to say the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. I never understood that until I stood with a condemned person who was facing execution and advocated for him. I also believe that in this country, that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. That in a country as wealthy as America, we can do better than have 38.5 million people living below the federal poverty level, families of 4 with household income of $13,000. In states like Alabama, we can do better than have whole counties where the median income is $10,000 a year, where there's 45 to 49% illiteracy in 2009. And because of that, I do think there is this need to act, this need to do something, this need to say something. We do have some wonderful icons, and they have in some ways shaped my work. When I was a young lawyer here in the 1980s, Rosa Parks, the great matriarch of the civil rights movement, came back to Montgomery. I had the thrill of spending some time with her, and she came to visit 2 other wonderful people we have in Montgomery, an amazing woman by the name of Johnny Carr, who was the architect in many ways of the Montgomery bus boycott, and another woman named Virginia Durr. Her husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. And these 3 women sat on her porch for about 2 hours talking. They invited me over there. And I just sat there and listened to them talk for 2 hours, and it was the most inspiring thing. And there's a lot of people, Jerome Gray and others who are here, who have fought these fights for so long. And when you listen to them talk, you get really excited and energized. And I just sat there and listened. And finally, after 2 hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, now, Bryan, now tell me what the EJI is and what are y'all going to do? And I started giving her my rap about what we were trying to do and how we're trying to deal with the death penalty and life imprisonment without parole for 13 and 14-year-old kids, and mass incarceration and wrongful convictions and abuse of power and all these things. I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked up at me and she said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave. And I really think that this is not a time for us to be so exhausted by the challenge of overcoming slavery, overcoming segregation, overcoming discrimination, that we stop. Or for us to be so unwilling to confront the complex problems because they require courage. I think that's essential if we're going to have a free and just society.
Even though I don't have cards yet, I know the gentleman had a question, so let me ask you to give your question, and then I'll ask people to pick up, speak loudly, and I'll try to repeat it for the benefit of the tape.
Injustice thrives where isolation reigns. The question is, how do you counsel individuals or organizations to overcome this myth or even the reality of isolation? And that's because if we attempt to deal with the question that you're dealing with, then we at some point isolate.
Okay. So the point was that injustice deals in isolation, and how do you counsel individuals and groups to engage in efforts to overcome that? Robert, do you want to start? Or whoever wants to start can.
Well, if it's okay, I'll take one quick start, just because I think that part of my interest in the struggle of Romani people, of the Roma, is very much an effort to kind of deal with that tendency toward isolation. There are disfavored people all over the world. And whether they are disfavored because of their race, because of their religion, because of their gender, because of their status, their ethnicity, the dynamics of injustice have a lot in common. And there is, I think, great power, great strength when we recognize that those dynamics have to be resisted no matter where they are, and no matter what the context, no matter what the political environment, that we have to make that absolute commitment to rejecting discrimination and bias, rejecting injustice. And I think it becomes an issue for everybody because ultimately, I believe, you judge the civility of a society, you judge the character of society, not by how you treat the rich and the privileged and the respected and the celebrated. You judge the society by how you treat the poor, the hated, the condemned, the disfavored. People coming to Alabama can't spend time in the big buildings of Birmingham or Montgomery or Mobile and say this is what Alabama is. If you really want to understand the character of Alabama, you've got to go to the jails and prisons. You've got to go to death row. You've got to go to the black belt. You've got to go to the places where people are struggling, because it's our willingness to deal with all of that that ultimately reveals what I think is most critical to who we are. And if we stand up and we try to protect the poor and the condemned and the imprisoned, we say that their rights are valid, their needs are legitimate, we see their rights as valuable as the rich and the powerful, then we emerge, then we evolve. But until we do that, I don't think any of us can isolate ourselves just because we can create a day-to-day that's a little more comfortable than somebody else and claim that our society is good. Our day may be good, our life may be good, but our society is not. And that's why I think your question is so incredibly important in dealing with these dynamics of who we are, all of us.
Robert and Isabela, I'm going to ask you to respond to that question, but I'm also going to go ahead and put the other question from the audience on the table, and maybe you can respond there also. And the question is, how does the ERRC engage the Roma communities, and individuals in its efforts? So if you could respond to the first question and also incorporate this question in your answer.
Sure. Well, I just, do you want to?
The second one.
Okay. On the question of injustice and isolation, I think it's a complex issue. I think isolation in Roma communities at times breeds injustice because it creates and it reinforces this sense of the other and of people who are outside of the mainstream of society and therefore in some ways not deserving of justice. At the same time as a report that Isabela cited earlier made note of, that they had some interesting results on some of the perceptions of Roma in Bulgaria, on the question of justice, and it seemed that some Roma living in more isolated rural communities in Bulgaria were reporting less less in the way of discrimination and adverse interaction with the majority population, and the authors of the study surmise that that's simply because they have no interaction with the majority population at all, simply none. But I think even in that case, that kind of isolation cannot be an excuse for allowing injustice to continue and allowing socioeconomic conditions in rural communities that rival anything that you would find in the Kibera slums in Nairobi, Kenya. It's a kind of a two-edged sword in the case of Roma in Eastern Europe.
Isabela?
Yes, just to echo, and I thank you, Ryan, for what you said. Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. You can't really treat things in isolation. And I used to say the same thing, that the level of discrimination Roma face kind of reflects on the way society is, and how tolerant is towards each other, and that we have to work together towards a common purpose, because it's not just as Czechs would say, our Roma are better than your Roma to the Slovaks. We are a society together, and we have to deal together with this, no matter who we are. To the second question, how we involve Roma communities in our work, that's a very good question. And we're always trying to challenge ourselves to the extent that we improve the way we try to involve Roma in the organization. And I'm proud to say that I'm one of the examples, because I just joined the organization less than 1 month ago, just because of the need that the work of the organization stems from within, that it actually reflects on the opinions and thoughts of the community itself. But beyond that, we actually, the whole work we do is informed by the work of the Roma individuals and Roma NGOs that we have them as partners in our work. And we do that through local monitors. We do that through engaging them in human rights training. And I just came recently from a human rights training in Turkey, where it was so refreshing to see Roma students being so interested in human rights work for their community in a country where the human rights discourse it's so light, it's not so consistent. Nonetheless, the young Roma understood how important it is for them to make a change for their community and to be engaged beyond their own interests. And this is one example of how we get involved with the community. And it's obviously it's a mutual approach. It's things we do to come to them and to reach out through the people, Roma people that we have in the organization. And it's also the other way around. They signal to us cases of human rights violation, and we try to respond very promptly through legal representation, through training, through broader counseling, and through giving them the opportunity, for instance, to speak out for themselves in different forums that we try to facilitate, like conferences or seminars. And obviously, we take at the core of our work the issues that Romani women are facing throughout Europe because of the level of multiple discrimination that they're facing. We think that it should be at the core of everything we do, and we are very happy that within the organization we also have a women's rights officer that is trying to work very closely with Romani women's organizations and individuals to bring that together in a so-called Roma women's movement that we are trying to establish.
I think Robert wanted to make a brief comment.
Yeah, it's interesting because the issue of how we engage with the Roma community and isolation are linked in a very notable case that the European Roma Rights Centre took before the European Court of Human Rights on the issue of school segregation, the DH case in the Czech Republic. And one of the problems that clearly emerged there, I mean, we had applicants who were aggrieved Roma people, but it was clear that for many in the community, they weren't sure that they wanted integration in the schools. They were accustomed to sending their children to segregated schools that were intended for kids with mental disabilities, and so there was a fair amount of awareness raising that had to go on, and that still has to go on, as to why integrated education might be a good thing. And when you're faced with the prospect of a hostile majority population and kids who don't want to sit next to you and parents who don't want you anywhere near their school on the one hand, and the comfortable segregated ghetto school on the other hand, it's easy to understand why Roma families might choose that segregated school. And so part of the work we have to do is working with them to think about what a different and better future might be for their children.
Thank you. I think we may have time for one more question, and then I'll leave enough time for each one of our recipients to perhaps have a 60-second concluding remark. This is a question from the audience. Could the panel speak to the role of corruption in the executive and the judiciary branch in their respective communities? And it mentions past communist government corruption and any other type of corruption that one might be aware of. And I will give you the. Let me layer that with something else, and just say to you that I know in the United States there have been many studies done on the perception of justice, and the perception varies among different ethnic groups. In fact, whites or Caucasians have the highest level of confidence in the justice system, no matter which study you do. Next, Asian American communities have the next highest confidence in the courts, followed by Latinos, and then African Americans have the lowest degree of confidence. Part of these things are fueled by the perceptions. And I guess it begs the question whether the perception of justice is as important as the reality. And I would put that in there as a filter for you to respond to this question.
Yeah. Well, I can begin with it. I think that it's a really important question because these perceptions are often reflected in realities that are just bewildering to people, and they do feed this doubt, this fear, this concern. I mean, the state of Alabama. We have 9 Supreme Court justices in this state. We have 5 judges on the Court of Criminal Appeals. We have 5 judges on the Court of Appeals. All of them are white. And for people of color, it is problematic that after all of this struggle, there are no people of color on appellate benches. Less than 2% of the trial court judges in this state are black. Less than 1% of the attorneys are black. Yet 67% of the people in jails and prison are African American. And these symbols, these realities, feed this perception that there's a difference that is explained by or shaped by or influenced by things like race. We're taking a case to the U.S. Supreme Court in a couple of months. It's challenging the constitutionality of life without parole for 13-year-old kids. The United States is the only country in the world that imposes life without parole on children as young as 13. All of the 13-year-old kids who've been sentenced to life without parole in America for non-homicides are black. 90% of all the 13-year-olds who have been sentenced for any crime are black. All of the kids under the age of 15 who have been sentenced to life without parole are black. And a lot of it has to do with the way we think about people's value, people's worth, people's dignity. And that's what feeds, in my judgment, these perceptions. You cannot, with our history, avoid those kinds of perceptions, those kinds of responses, until you affirmatively say, we're going to do something about this. And that's why I do think that there is this relationship. I think corruption comes when we fail to recognize what these realities do to public confidence, to the integrity of the society. The death penalty in many communities has that same legacy. We're in a state where there are literally hundreds of people buried in the ground who were lynched, who were accused of something bad and lynched. And we haven't done anything to reconcile ourselves to that history, and it leaves open these concerns. And so I believe we have to be concerned with these perceptions. We have to be concerned with the realities that create those perceptions. And until we make the kind of strong, clear, consistent commitment, and we say the things that suggest and sustain that commitment, these differences are going to undermine our ability to get to a fair and just place. And I think that there is so much that needs to be done to overcome, to challenge, to work on, to respond to these very fundamental differences in the way the system works and for whom it works.
I will very briefly answer because I'm not a lawyer, but more so a human rights defender. But as an observer, obviously what I can say is that corruption is one of the obstacles for of access to justice. And as an example, I would say that throughout the Central and Eastern European countries, the possibility for a defendant to be granted free legal representation, defense is left many times to the discretion of authorities, which obviously, from my standpoint, can be abused on reasons of corruption. And that's why it has been so hard so far to find a uniform rule for providing free legal aid, and it's just Poland that has one, and it's based solely on poverty, whereby the defendant has to prove that he doesn't have sufficient means. But in the rest, it's basically it's so different, and it's so thin, and you never know what you can get, obviously.
I just want to, it's helpful for Bryan to, I think, expand the definition of corruption perhaps beyond what the questioner had meant, which was the notion of money changing hands in order to achieve an outcome. In old Soviet days, we used to speak about telefonная prava, which was a Russian expression meaning telephone justice, in any case that was politically significant. And by definition at that time, any case related to human rights was politically significant. The judge was not the decider of the case. The case was decided by a Communist Party official who would call the judge and tell the judge what the outcome should be. Unfortunately, in some parts of particularly the former Soviet Union, that system still holds. In Eastern Europe, the legacy of that system is still disturbs the quest for justice, even if it's not a routine matter. But what you have, I think, today is a broader, the broader corrupting influences of discrimination and of protection of officials against punishment for crime. So, for example, if you have police officers who are involved in abuse of Roma detainees, which is still unfortunately a frequent occurrence, I think the confidence level that I have in justice systems in the region to mete out justice is quite low, and impunity is still a big issue. We recently had a victory, actually just last week, in a case in Slovakia involving police abuse, and the case took something like 9 years to come to this conclusion and a finding of guilt, at least for some of the police officers involved. So.
Thank you for lending your hearts, your hands, your energies, and your talents to the cause of justice. And today, I want to again thank the Peter and Patricia Gruber Foundation for shining their light on the work of these fabulous people and adding its flame to the flame that's already been ignited by the work that you're doing. We're all better for it. The world is a better place because of the efforts of Robert and Isabela with the ERRC and Bryan Stevenson with the Equal Justice Initiative. And Mr. Stevenson, thank you for this world treasure in Bryan Stevenson. Let me turn it back over to Patricia Gruber, our heroine.
Thank you, Judge Donald. Thank you, Bryan Stevenson. Thank you, Bob Kushen and Isabela Mihalache. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming and joining us today. Please join me in a final salute to our recipients, and this concludes today's ceremony.